The Prophet and the Preacher. The morning Jerry Wallace first walked into the parsonage, Thomas Cone was having a hard Tuesday. It was one of those humid, heavy air mornings where the red clay in the beige lift chair, his fingers curled uselessly over the armrests, staring out at the pine line and feeling every bit of his 81 years and the heavy weight of the diagnosis. He was waiting for the new caregiver. Thomas had spent his entire life being the man who visited the sick, the man who offered the steady hand, the man who prayed over the bed. Being the man in the bed or pinned to the chair was a suit of clothes that didn't fit him right. Jerry Wallace didn't knock on the sunroom doorframe, he just walked in, carrying a small black right at home bag and a thermos that smelled of chicory and strong roast. He was a medium built man, broad shouldered, with skin the color of dark walnut and eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime squinting into the sun. He wore a new pair of blue, freshly pressed scrubs and sparkling bright gym shoes. Jerry stopped at the edge of the rug, looked at the lift chair, then looked Thomas straight in the eye. He didn't do the polite, hushed voice dance that most visitors did when they saw the medical tubing and the wheelchair parked in the corner. "You must be the preacher," Jerry said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I am," Thomas said, his voice coming out a little thinner than he liked. "Thomas Cone. And you're Jerry?" "Jerry Wallace," he said. He walked over, didn't offer a hand, knowing Thomas couldn't easily lift his, but instead laid his palm flat on the armrest right next to Thomas's hand. It was a gesture of presence, not a demand. "I don't hold with pastor or reverend much, if it's all the same to you. Out where I'm from, a man's name is his calling." "Where are you from, Jerry?" "Over in East Drayton, down by the old Mill Creek." Thomas knew the area. It was the black side of the county line, a pocket of shotgun houses and dirt yard churches that Piney Grove civic leaders usually ignored unless they needed seasonal labor. The spiritual landscape there was different, too. No neat printed bulletins or timed 5-minute choir specials. It was a place of long, sweeping revivals and midnight prayers. "Well," Thomas said, trying to find his old pulpit dignity, "I appreciate you coming out. The boys, Jeffrey and Jason, my daughter Jody, they worry. They think I need a shadow." Jerry let out a dry, quiet sound that was half laugh, half sigh. He set his thermos down on the side table, right next to Thomas's Bible and an empty coffee mug. "I ain't your shadow preacher," Jerry said, looking out the sunroom window at the pasture ridge. "A shadow just mimics what you do. I'm here to do what you can't do so you can keep doing what you're supposed to do." "And what's that?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowed. Jerry turned back, his face completely serious, devoid of the cheap comfort Thomas was used to hearing. "Listen to the Lord. A man who spent 50 years talking for a living usually has a hard time hearing. Now that he's quieted your feet, maybe you'll start paying attention." The bluntness of it caught in Thomas's throat. Any deacon in Piney Grove who spoke to him with that kind of unvarnished directness would have triggered a 3-hour committee meeting. But looking at Jerry, Thomas didn't see malice. He saw a man who spoke the truth the way a carpenter uses a plumb line, not to break the wall, but to see if it's straight. "You've got a bold mouth, Jerry Wallace," Thomas said, a tiny spark of his old fire returning to his eyes. Jerry reached down, picked up the empty coffee mug from the table, and unscrewed the lid of his thermos. "The Lord didn't give me a quiet spirit, preacher," Jerry said, pouring the dark, steaming coffee into Thomas's mug. "He gave me a bucket of sweet feed and a job to do. Now, are we going to sit here and argue about my mouth, or are you going to let me help you get a sip of this coffee?" Thomas looked at the mug, then up at Jerry's heavy, steady hands. The invisible line between the white preacher from the brick church and the black prophet from the creek bed didn't disappear. It just suddenly seemed entirely irrelevant. "Pour it full, Jerry," Thomas said quietly, "and let's see what else you've got to say." The weight of the sling, the test of their partnership, didn't happen while discussing theology over coffee. It happened on a Thursday morning when Thomas's body completely mutinied. It was a manure pile day. Thomas's nervous system was firing erratically, leaving his torso rigid and his legs entirely non-functional. He was stuck in bed, soaked through with sweat from the sheer exertion of trying to turn over, feeling an acute, burning humiliation that he couldn't manage his own frame. Jerry walked into the bedroom, carrying the heavy canvas sling for the mechanical Hoyer lift. The metal apparatus stood in the corner like a cold industrial skeleton. To Thomas, that lift was the ultimate monument to his loss of dignity. "I don't think I can do the chair today, Jerry," Thomas muttered, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Just leave me be. I'll stay flat." Jerry didn't argue. He walked to the side of the bed, unrolled the canvas, and gently began digging his thick fingers under Thomas's shoulder to position the fabric. "Staying flat is how the rust gets in, preacher," Jerry said softly, his voice dropping into a rhythmic working cadence. "We aren't letting the rust win on a Thursday. Roll toward me now. Lean your weight into my chest." "I can't," Thomas rasped, his jaw clenched. "I don't have the leverage." "I am the leverage," Jerry said. With a smooth, practiced strength that didn't pinch or rush, Jerry reached across, anchored his forearm behind Thomas's hip, and pulled the retired pastor toward him. For a second, Thomas was entirely suspended against Jerry's chest, his face pressed into the new scrubs of Jerry's shirt, smelling the sharp scent of laundry soap and wood smoke. Jerry didn't let him slip. He slid the sling underneath, rolled Thomas back onto his spine, and began hooking the heavy metal chains to the overhead bar. As the hydraulic pump began to hiss, lifting Thomas's dead weight into the open air, a wave of raw panic hit him. He was dangling between the floor and the ceiling, completely helpless. His breathing came shallow and fast. Jerry stepped right into his line of sight. He didn't look at the machine. He kept his eyes locked on Thomas's face. He reached up and placed both of his massive, calloused hands directly over Thomas's trembling shoulders, acting as a human ballast. "Look at me, Thomas," Jerry commanded, using the preacher's first name for the very first time. "Don't look at the floor. Look right here. Breathe out. Let the iron hold the weight, and let me hold you. I got the line." Thomas forced his eyes to lock onto Jerry's steady, unblinking gaze. He let out a long, ragged breath. Slowly, the machine swung Thomas over the green lift chair and lowered him into the cushions. Jerry unhooked the chains, pulled the sling free, and stepped back, his own breath coming a little heavy. The room was quiet for a long time, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Thomas adjusted his arms, his heart slowly settling back into its proper rhythm. "Over at Piney Grove," Thomas said, his voice rough from the panic, "we always talked about the Holy Spirit as a comforter, like an invisible, quiet peace that settles over a sanctuary during the invitation hymn. Very orderly, very decent." Jerry leaned against the chest of drawers, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. A slow, knowing smile crept onto his face. "Is that right?" Jerry asked. "Yes," Thomas said, looking down at his hands, "but hanging in midair just now, I didn't feel an orderly peace. I felt terrified. And then you put your hands on my shoulders, and I thought about how you carried that weight without flinching." He looked up at Jerry. "How does the Spirit look down by the Mill Creek, Jerry?" Jerry straightened up, his eyes softening. "Down at the creek, preacher, we don't look for the Spirit in the quiet, carpeted aisles. We look for him in the muscle. We look for him in the folks who have the strength to hold up a house when the foundation starts to slide. To us, the Spirit ain't just a comfort. He's the wind that blows when you got nothing left in your lungs. And he's the iron in a man's spine when the world tells him to drop." Jerry walked over, picked up the coffee mug, and set it carefully near Thomas's good hand. "Your people built a beautiful brick church, Thomas," Jerry said, his voice dropping into that deep prophetic register. "But the Lord doesn't live in the mortar. He lives in the harness. And right now, you and I are hooked into the same line." Thomas looked out the window at the pasture ridge, the red clay looking a little less hostile in the morning light. He reached out his fingers and touched the warm side of the coffee mug. "I suppose your definition has a bit more utility on a Thursday morning, Jerry," Thomas said, a faint, genuine smile breaking through his fatigue. Jerry laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the small sunroom. "It surely does, preacher. It surely does." The mechanics of prayer. The clash of ecclesiastical styles didn't happen by appointment. It happened on a Tuesday evening when Robert Eves and Deacon Jim Henry dropped by the parsonage unannounced to deliver the quarterly missions report. In Piney Grove, church business was conducted with a specific quiet decorum. Prayer in Thomas's old sanctuary was an orderly affair. Heads bowed precisely at 45 degrees, hands folded neatly in laps, and a solemn, predictable vocabulary filled with thous and arts that signaled everyone was on their best behavior in the presence of the Almighty. Jim and Robert walked through the unlocked kitchen door, calling out a casual "preacher" into the hallway. Receiving no answer, they followed the low, resonant sound of voices vibrating down the corridor toward the sunroom. At the threshold, both deacons came to a dead halt. The sunroom was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the porch light bleeding through the glass. Jerry Wallace wasn't sitting in the straight-backed visitor's chair. He was down on his knees directly on the woven rug, his large frame bent forward next to the lift chair. He had one massive dark hand anchored firmly on Thomas's paralyzed right knee, and his other hand was lifted flat toward the ceiling, palm open. They weren't taking turns. Jerry was leading, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, driving cadence that sounded less like a Sunday petition and more like a man trying to start a stubborn tractor engine in the dead of winter. "Lord, lift a stone off his chest tonight," Jerry was murmuring, his baritone voice sending a distinct hum through the floorboards. "Clear the road in his lungs. We ain't asking for a circus parade, Lord. We're just asking for the daily bread of enough strength to see the morning light hit that ridge. Stand by Thomas tonight. Keep the iron in his spine." Thomas sat back in the cushions, his eyes tightly shut, his breathing deep and ragged. He wasn't just listening. His head was nodding in time with Jerry's phrases, his face wet with tears that he couldn't lift a hand to wipe away. It was raw, vocal, and entirely unpolished. The kind of creek-bed lament that Piney Grove's governing board usually associated with storefront missions and camp meetings down in the swamps. Robert Eves froze, clutching his manila folder against his stomach like a shield. Jim Henry, a man whose spine had been stiffened by 40 years of running the county bank, let out a sharp, dry, administrative cough, the exact noise he made right before voting down a building expansion. Jerry didn't startle. He didn't even lower his lifted hand. He brought the prayer to a deliberate, heavy close. "Amen," Jerry said softly. He let his hand rest on Thomas's knee for one more beat, then slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his joints popping in the quiet room. He wiped his palms on his freshly pressed scrubs and turned to face the two intruders, his expression completely untroubled. "Evening, brothers," Jerry said, his voice level. "We were just clearing some brush." Robert shifted his weight, his eyes darting from Jerry to Thomas's tear-stained face, looking intensely uncomfortable with the emotional proximity of the scene. "Thomas," Robert said, his voice stiffly formal, "we didn't mean to interrupt a service. We just brought the cooperative program numbers by for you to look over." Thomas opened his eyes. The vulnerability from a moment before evaporated, replaced by a quiet, insubordinate authority that Robert hadn't seen since Thomas last stood behind the oak pulpit. "You didn't interrupt a thing, Robert," Thomas said, his voice thin but clear. "Lay the folder on the table." Jim stepped forward quickly, glad for a task, and slid the papers next to the Bible. Jerry picked up his thermos from the side table, glanced at Thomas with a subtle, knowing wink, and moved toward the door. "I'll go check the latch on the back screen, preacher," Jerry said, stepping past the deacons. "Give you gentlemen some room to talk numbers." Once Jerry's heavy steps faded into the kitchen, Robert leaned in a little closer, his brow furrowed. Thomas, I know you need the physical help around here with the lifting and all, but that was a bit unseemly, wasn't it? We have a certain way of doing things in the association that looked more like a revival tent than a Baptist parsonage. Thomas looked down at the manila folder, then up at the man who had sat in his front pew for 3 decades. Robert, Thomas said, a dry smile touching the corners of his mouth, for 30 years, you've read me written prayers from the deacon manual during our budget deficits. They were always decent, they were always orderly, and they always stayed right inside the room. He paused, looking out at the dark pasture line. But Jerry doesn't read the manual. When my breathing gets tight and the panic sets in, Jerry goes clean down into the well to fetch me a bucket of water because he sees I'm dying of thirst. There's a big difference between studying the map and actually walking a man down the road. I suggest you open that folder and tell me about the mission's money, because the theology in this room is already taken care of. The screen door gave its familiar double clack, and a moment later, Emmett Stevens stepped into the sunroom. He didn't have his usual manila folder of church receipts, and he didn't pull his shoulders back into his standard deacon posture. He looked smaller, his faded ball cap gripped tightly in both hands, checking the grease on his knuckles out of habit before looking up at the lift chair. Jerry Wallace stepped in behind him, set a fresh box of tissues on the side table, and gave Emmett a slow, deliberate nod that communicated everything. Emmett's tractor had a flat down by the creek, Jerry said softly, but I believe his spirit's got the bigger leak today. I'm going to check on the oil in the truck, Thomas. Y'all take your time. When the kitchen door closed, the room fell into a heavy country silence. Emmett sat down in the straight-back chair, the cane bottom creaking under his weight. He stared at his boots for a long time, his jaw working before he finally spoke. It's Martha Preacher, Emmett said, his voice cracking on the name. The doctors up in Athens, they did the scans yesterday. They say the cancer's moved into the bone. There ain't a machine they got that can chase it down now. I spent the morning out on the tractor trying to pray, but the words just felt like dry husks. I couldn't get a single thought above the exhaust pipe. Thomas didn't try to nod. His neck wouldn't allow it, but his eyes held Emmett's with a fierce, unblinking clarity. He didn't offer a quick scriptural band-aid or a practiced pastoral phrase from the old days. Instead, he let the silence pool in the room until Emmett's breathing slowed down. Emmett, Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that required him to gather his air before each sentence. Do you know what I was doing at 4 o'clock this morning? Emmett looked up, squinting through the sunlight. No, sir. I was building a roof over your house, Thomas said. Emmett blinked, confused. My legs were firing like hot wires, Thomas continued, his left hand twitching on the armrest. I couldn't move an inch, so I went down the road in my mind. I walked past the cemetery, took the left at the Mill Creek, and parked myself right in your driveway. I sat on your porch in my thoughts, and I started framing up a room for you and Martha. Thomas closed his eyes for a second, pulling the blueprint back into his active mind. I didn't pray a general prayer about healing or comfort, Emmett. I got specific. I prayed for the floorboards under Martha's side of the bed that they wouldn't creak when you get up in the dark to fetch her water. I prayed for the kitchen stove so the pilot light would stay lit so you wouldn't have to fiddle with matches when your hands were shaking. And I prayed for the iron in your knees, Emmett, because I knew you were going to have to carry the heavy end of the log these next few months. Emmett's shoulders gave way, his head dropping into his calloused hands as the tears finally came. He didn't sob. He just let the weight of the pasture drain out of him right onto the woven rug. The world thinks I'm just an old machine parked in this beige chair waiting on the battery to run out, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the quiet room with an absolute enterprising authority. But I told you last month, we are still pouring concrete. I spent 3 hours this morning anchoring the columns under your family before you even knew the storm was hitting the ridge. The foundation is set, Emmett. You don't have to hold the roof up on your own steam. The thought is already hammered into place, and the Lord's got the weight of the timber. Emmett sat there for a long time, the shadows of the pines stretching longer across the floorboards. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. In Piney Grove, when a neighbor frames a house for you after a fire, you don't thank him with words. You step inside and take shelter. When Jerry walked back into the room 20 minutes later, Emmett was standing up, his cap back on his head, his face clear. He laid a heavy hand on Thomas's motionless shoulder, gave it one solid press, and walked out into the afternoon dusk. Jerry watched the truck pull out of the driveway, then looked down at Thomas, whose eyes were heavy with the massive physical exhaustion of the effort. You poured a lot of yardage on that one, preacher, Jerry said quietly, reaching for the water glass. It was a big ditch, Jerry, Thomas whispered, his eyes closing as he sank back into the canvas harness of the chair. But the columns held. The rain was tapping a steady, flat rhythm against the sunroom glass, casting the pine needles outside in a dull, wet silver. Inside, the only light came from the small brass desk lamp on the side table, throwing Jerry's shadow long and heavy across the wall. Jerry was sitting in the visitor's chair, slowly peeling an orange with his pocket knife. The citrus smell cut sharply through the dampness of the room. Jerry, Thomas said, his voice quiet, barely carrying over the sound of the rain. You called yourself a prophet the other day, or at least you didn't deny it when I said you had a bold mouth. What's the difference to you between a man who stands behind an oak pulpit for 50 years and a man like you? Jerry didn't stop peeling. He slid the blade under the white pith, keeping the orange rind in one continuous, perfect spiral. A pastor, Jerry said, his voice low and deliberate, is a builder of fences, Thomas. You spent 50 years making sure the gate was latched, the roof didn't leak, and the wolves stayed on the other side of the creek. You had to worry about the budget, the music, and whether the deacons' wives were speaking to each other. Your job was to keep the flock together, keep them fed, and keep them from wandering off the edge of the ridge. He laid the pocket knife down on the table and split the orange in half, offering the larger share to Thomas, who shook his head slightly. Jerry took a section and chewed slowly before continuing. "That's a holy work," Jerry said. "Without the pastor, the sheep get scattered by the first high wind, and the cold gets into their bones. But a pastor's danger is always the fence. You get so busy maintaining the perimeter that you start to think the fence is the whole world. You start valuing the peace more than the truth." Thomas watched the orange spiral on the table. "And the prophet?" "The prophet doesn't care about the fence," Jerry said, his eyes locking onto Thomas's. "The prophet lives out in the wild grass where the ground is uneven. He doesn't build anything. His job is to stand on the high rocks, look at the sky, and shout when a storm is coming, even if it ruins the church picnic. If the grass inside the fence goes sour, the prophet is the one who has to kick the gate open and tell the shepherd his sheep are eating poison." He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees. "A pastor wants things orderly, Thomas. He wants a nice, clean bulletin and a timed altar call. The prophet wants things to be true, and truth is rarely decent, and it's never orderly. The prophet's mouth is bold because he doesn't have to worry about who's going to pay the light bill next month. He only has to worry about what the Lord is saying right this second." Thomas let out a slow, ragged breath. He looked down at his own useless hands, then up at the tall man sitting opposite him. "I suppose that makes the prophet a very difficult person to have in a committee meeting." "The worst," Jerry agreed, a rare, deep chuckle rumbling in his chest. "We don't make good neighbors, and we make terrible deacons. A prophet without a pastor is just a wild man throwing rocks in the dark, scaring the herd. But a pastor without a prophet—" Jerry reached out and gently laid his hand on Thomas's motionless knee. "A pastor without a prophet just builds a beautiful tomb and calls it a sanctuary. The Lord parked me in this sunroom because your fences got too small, Thomas. He sent a wild man from the creek bed to tell you that just because you can't walk the perimeter anymore doesn't mean the pasture has shrunk. He's taking down your fences so you can finally see the whole mountain." Thomas sat quietly, the rain continuing its steady hammer on the glass. He felt the heavy, warm pressure of Jerry's hand on his knee, and for the first time in months, the sunroom didn't feel like a cage. It felt like the edge of the wild. The rain had cleared by Friday morning, leaving the red clay of the parsonage driveway smelling of wet iron and pine needles. Reverend Christopher Miller, the young, polished pastor who had succeeded Thomas at Piney Grove Church, sat in the sunroom's straight-back chair. Christopher looked exactly like a man who spent his mornings in a climate-controlled study. His hair was parted with surgical precision. His blue Oxford shirt was pressed flat. He carried a neat yellow legal pad covered in precise blue-inked bullet points. Jerry Wallace was in the corner, quietly wiping down the metal frame of the Hoyer lift with a damp cloth, his back to the room. His presence was a silent, heavy weight. "Thomas," Christopher said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees, his legal pad poised, "I'm at my wits' end with the finance committee. Robert Eves wants to freeze the benevolence fund to prioritize the sanctuary roof, and the younger families are threatening to leave for the community church down in Athens if we don't start a contemporary service. I feel like the perimeter is rotting out from under me. How did you keep the fence so tight for 50 years without the whole pasture falling apart? In the old days, Thomas would have reached into his administrative filing cabinet. He would have told Christopher how to massage Roscoe's ego, how to form a subcommittee to study contemporary music, and how to balance the budget to keep both sides quiet. He would have given him the blueprint for a perfect, sturdy fence. But Thomas didn't look at his legal pad. Instead, he looked past Christopher's shoulder out through the clean glass at the wild, untamed pasture ridge rising toward the gray sky. Christopher, Thomas said, his voice slow and gravelly, but carrying a sudden dry weight that made the young preacher freeze. You're wearing yourself out trying to be a carpenter for a fence the Lord never asked you to build. Christopher blinked, his pen hovering. Sir, you think your job is to keep the sheep from looking at the woods, Thomas whispered, a faint, unvarnished smile touching his lips. You think if Robert Eves gets upset, or if 20 families walk down the road to Athens, that the kingdom is going to slide into the ditch? You're running yourself ragged trying to keep the gate latched. But if we don't keep them together, Thomas, what do we have? Christopher asked, his voice rising with a genuine stress vulnerability. Without the structure, the church dies. Thomas let his head rest back against the beige, soft fabric of the lift chair. The church doesn't live in the fence, Christopher. It lives in the grass. If the grass inside your yard has gone sour and dry because you're too busy painting the posts, of course, the sheep are going to lean against the gate. They're hungry. Jerry stopped wiping the metal lift. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders rose and fell with a long, quiet breath. Stop trying to manage the perimeter, Thomas said, his eyes locking onto his young successor with an absolute uncompromising clarity. Let Robert worry about the roof. If those families want to go to Athens, let them go with a blessing. Your job isn't to hold a crowd hostage in a brick courtyard. Your job is to stand flat-footed on the dirt and tell them the absolute truth about the shepherd, even if it makes the deacons uncomfortable. Kick the gate open, Christopher. Let them see the wild pasture. Christopher sat entirely still. The legal pad in his lap suddenly looked very small, very yellow, and entirely useless. He looked at Thomas, then glanced back at Jerry, who had finally turned around, leaning his tall frame against the metal lift, his arms crossed over his denim shirt, watching the scene with a slow, knowing nod, with a soft, "That's amen." I don't know how to lead like that, Thomas, Christopher admitted quietly, his polished exterior completely cracking. It feels unsafe. It is unsafe, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a deep, peaceful register. But it's the only way you'll ever find out who's actually holding the rope. The sunroom communion. The distant bronze clang of the Piney Grove church bells traveled easily across the damp valley, filtering through the open screens of the sunroom. It was 10:45 on a Sunday morning. For 50 years, that sound had been Thomas's starting gun. It meant his tie was knotted perfectly, his sermon notes were tucked into the leather Bible, and his mind was racing through the order of service. Today, the bells found him in his faded flannel pajamas, his hands resting like dead leaves on his lap, pinned to the beige lift chair. Sunday mornings were always the hardest. The silence in the parsonage felt twice as heavy when the rest of the town was dressed in their Sunday best, sitting in the pews he had built. Jerry Wallace walked in from the kitchen. He wasn't wearing his usual work scrubs today. He wore a clean, pressed white shirt, though the collar was unbuttoned and his sleeves were still rolled to his forearms. He carried a small wooden cutting board. On it sat a heel of crusty cornbread left over from yesterday's supper and a small jelly glass filled with dark grape juice. He set the board down on the side table, right over the water rings. "You're quiet today, preacher," Jerry said, pulling up his chair. He didn't look at Thomas. He looked out at the pasture ridge where the morning mist was still burning off the pine tops. "I'm just listening to the bells, Jerry," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. 50 years. I never missed a Sunday. Not for flu, not for family, not for nothing. It feels strange to be off the line. "They're doing just fine over there," Jerry said, his voice level. "Christopher's probably sweating through his Oxford shirt right about now, trying to keep Robert from looking at the budget lines. The fence is holding." Thomas let out a dry, short breath. "I suppose so." Jerry turned his head and looked at the cutting board, then at Thomas. "We ain't going to let the bells have the last word today. You might not have a pulpit, Thomas, but you still have a table." Jerry reached down, picked up the piece of cornbread, and broke it in two. The yellow crumbs fell onto the dark wood of the cutting board. He held one half out, placing it gently between Thomas's thumb and index finger, helping the stiffened muscles of Thomas's left hand close around the crust. "Over at the Mill Creek," Jerry said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, low cadence, "we don't wait for a silver plate to come down the aisle. We break whatever we got, because the Lord didn't use silver and he didn't use white linen. He just used what was on the table." Thomas looked at the rough piece of cornbread in his hand. It was a far cry from the neat, square wafers his deacons used to pass in the quiet, carpeted sanctuary. It was heavy, greasy from the cast iron skillet, and smelled of bacon fat and cornmeal. "This is the body, Thomas," Jerry said softly, his large hand resting on the arm of the lift chair. "Broken for the pasture in the creek bed. Broken for the man who can't stand up and the man who's got to carry him. Take it." Thomas lifted his hand, his elbow shaking with the effort, and brought the bread to his mouth. It tasted of salt and earth. He chewed slowly, his eyes burning, but he didn't look away from Jerry's steady, unblinking gaze. Jerry took his own piece and ate it, then picked up the jelly glass. He didn't offer the glass to Thomas. He knew Thomas couldn't lift it without spilling. Instead, Jerry placed his hand behind Thomas's neck, supporting the heavy, tired muscles, and brought the glass gently to Thomas's lips. "This is the covenant," Jerry murmured, "the line that doesn't break. Sip it slow, brother. Thomas drank. The sweet, sharp juice cut through the dry taste of the cornmeal. Jerry held the glass steady until Thomas nodded, then set it down on the table. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the wind passing through the screens and the faint, dying ring of the distant church bell as the service across the road began. Thomas let his head rest back against the beige fabric. The heavy, clawing grief that usually settled over him on Sunday mornings was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid warmth that seemed to sink deep into his bones. Jerry, Thomas said, his voice clearer than it had been all morning, who taught you how to administer the sacrament? Jerry smiled, a slow, deep crease on his face, and reached for the damp cloth to wipe the crumbs from the side table. Nobody, preacher, Jerry said, looking back out at the ridge. But when you spend enough time out in the weather, you learn how to find the water without a map. We had our service. Now let's see about getting you turned toward the sun. The interpreter, the transition didn't happen with the sudden dramatic crisis. It came in the quiet, steady thinning of Thomas's voice. By late August, the ALS had begun to claw at the muscles of his throat. The crisp, resonant diction that had once carried to the back pews of the brick sanctuary was gone, replaced by a thick, slurred murmur that sounded like stone dragging over river gravel. To the casual visitors from the church, it was a barrier. They would lean in, squinting, nodding politely at words they only half understood, before retreating into safe, loud pleasantries. To Jerry, however, the change was just another shift in the weather. On a Tuesday afternoon, Robert Eves came by with a document regarding the cemetery endowment. A legal detail needed the former pastor's signature, or at least his verbal assent, before the board could move forward. Robert stood by the side table, holding the paper under the lamp, his face tight with frustration. Thomas, I need to know if we have your blessing to clear that cedar grove on the north boundary of the church plots, Robert said, speaking too loudly, as if Thomas's failing throat had somehow damaged his ears. Some of the family members are saying those trees were dedicated in memory of the 1954 youth group. Do you remember if there was a formal covenant on those cedars? Thomas closed his eyes, took a deep, rattling breath, and spoke the Sios Kone, his tongue thick, the consonants dissolved into air. He tried again, his jaw working hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead from the sheer physical labor of trying to shape a simple word. The Kone was Robert bent closer, his brow furrowed. The corner? The corner was what, Thomas? I'm sorry, I can't quite make it out. Thomas's left hand twitched in frustration against the beige armrest. He looked away, his jaw tightening, the familiar shadow of humiliation creeping across his face. Jerry, who had been quietly cleaning the glass on the western window, set his rag down. He didn't rush over. He walked with his usual slow, heavy step and stood right behind the lift chair, his large hand resting lightly on the wooden headrest just above Thomas's left ear. He's saying the covenant wasn't on the trees, Robert, Jerry said, his low baritone filling the room with an easy, unshakable calm. He's saying the covenant was on the land. The 1954 group didn't dedicate the cedars, they dedicated the soil they planted them in. So the church could never sell that corner for commercial use. Thomas turned his eyes toward Jerry, a quiet, profound relief washing over his face. He let out a soft, trailing breath. Yes, he whispered. Yes. Robert looked from Jerry to Thomas, clearly startled. How did you understood all of that? I know his breathing, Robert, Jerry said, not looking at the deacon, but keeping his eyes on the pasture line outside. When a man's throat gets tight, he has to prioritize his air. He can't waste breath in the middle of a word. You have to listen for the anchor of the thought. Jerry leaned down slightly, his shoulder brushing against the beige fabric of the chair. Tell him about the ledger. Preacher, Jerry said softly. I got the line. Thomas looked up at Robert, his eyes clear and sharp, and began to speak again, his voice a low, rhythmic hum of broken syllables. The red boob, the red book, Jerry translated instantly, his voice matching Thomas's cadence exactly. In the bottom drawer of the desk in the study, Jerry continued, without a second of hesitation. In 1954, there's a handwritten ledger from December of 1954, Jerry finished. The clerk's signature is on the third page. It tells you exactly how far that dedicated boundary goes. Robert stood entirely still, the paper in his hand suddenly looking very light. He looked at the retired pastor, whose body was locked in the beige chair, and then at the tall man from the creek bed who stood behind him like a human tower. For 50 years, Thomas had been the voice of Piney Grove. Now the voice belonged to both of them, one providing the soul, the other providing the breath. I see, Robert stammered, stepping back toward the door. I'll go look for the red book, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. When the screen door clacked shut, the sunroom returned to its quiet rhythm. The shadows of the pine trees were beginning to stretch across the rug. Thomas sat still for a long time, his breathing slow and shallow. He didn't look defeated. He looked at Jerry, who had picked up his glass cleaner and was heading back to the western window. Jerry, Thomas said, the word coming out as a soft, slurred whisper, my mouth. Jerry stopped, turned his head, and gave Thomas a slow, rare smile that reached all the way to his eyes. No, preacher, Jerry said, stepping back to the window. I ain't your mouth. You're still the one doing the talking. I'm just the amplifier. Now stop wasting your wind on me and get some rest. We got a lot of concrete to pour tomorrow. The red bucket of Piney Grove. The screen door didn't just clack this time. It rattled on its hinges as Coy Higgins kicked it open. Coy was a hard pine farmer with a face the color of cured ham and a temper that usually ran about 10 degrees hotter than the August humidity. He marched into the sunroom carrying a copy of the Piney Grove Gazette, his thumb pressing so hard into the newsprint that his knuckle was white. Jerry Wallace was sitting on the low wooden box. hands loosely clasped, his eyes shifting calmly and slowly from the window to the storm brewing in Coy's boots. Thomas lay back in the beige fabric chair, his head propped at that slight, permanent tilt. "It's a flat-out disgrace, Thomas," Coy shouted, spitting the words into the quiet room. He didn't sit down. He paced the narrow strip of linoleum between the lift chair and the window, waving the paper. "Billy Vance and the county commission just signed off on a lumber easement. They're going to run the heavy logging trucks right down the old church boundary line, not 10 feet from the headstones in the Union Cemetery. My grandmother May is buried right on that ridge. They're going to shake the dirt right off her coffin." Coy stopped, his chest heaving under his sweat-stained khaki shirt. "I went to Christopher about it," Coy hissed, his voice trembling with a raw, jagged fury. "He told me we need to pray for the commissioners and seek a peaceful resolution. Peaceful resolution. I want that boy to stand in the pulpit this Sunday and call Billy Vance what he is, a thief and a coward. I want the church to block the easement with our own tractors if we have to. But Christopher won't do it. He's soft, Thomas. He's got no iron in his blood. I want you to tell Robert and tell him to get his nephew in line, or we're going to tear this parish wide open." The room was, Robert, with the heat of Coy's rage. The silence that followed was heavy, save for the dry, rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan. Thomas didn't blink. He didn't raise his left hand, and he didn't call for the phone. He just watched Coy with a pair of ancient, patient eyes that had seen 40 years of county disputes rise and fall like weeds in the clay. He let the silence stretch, letting Coy's hot breath clear out of the air. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was a thin, gravelly murmur, barely louder than the hum of the fan. "Coy," he whispered. Coy stopped his pacing, his shoulders still rigid, but he leaned in to hear. "What is it, preacher?" "Do you remember?" Thomas's throat clicked, the word sticking. He took a slow, shallow breath. "The black bray," Coy's brow furrowed. He looked toward Jerry, his anger momentarily snagged by confusion. "The blackberry? What's he talking about, Jerry?" Jerry didn't stand up. He just leaned his elbows on his knees, his deep voice sliding into the gap like a cool draft. "He's asking if you remember your grandmother May's blackberry cobbler, Coy," Jerry translated, his tone entirely level. "The one she used to bring to the August Association meetings." Coy's jaw worked for a second, the steam leaking out of his posture just a bit. "Of course I remember them. Everybody does. She used to pick the wild ones down by the creek herself. Hands would be stained purple for a week. She always saved the corner," Thomas whispered, a faint, genuine light appearing in his eyes. "She saved the corner piece for you," Jerry continued, matching the slow cadence of Thomas's breathing, "because she knew you liked the crust burnt just a little bit. She'd wrap it in a clean dish towel and slide it under your seat before the preaching even started." Coy stood entirely still, in the middle of the room. His hands slowly dropped to his sides, the newspaper folding in his grip. The red in his cheeks began to fade, replaced by a sudden, quiet paleness around his eyes. "She did," Coy said, his voice dropping an octave, the hard edge completely vanishing. "She tell me, don't you let your cousin see this, Coy, or there won't be enough to go around. She was a good woman, preacher. She worked this ground until her knees gave out." "She was," Thomas whispered. He let his eyes hold Coy's, his gaze soft but unyielding. "And she is safe, Coy." Coy looked down at his boots, his thumb tracing the edge of the newspaper. "The loggers can't shake her rest," Thomas said, each word coming with a deliberate, heavy weight. "The Lord's got her in the barn. You don't have to fight the trucks to keep her, sweet." The silence returned, but it wasn't hot anymore. It was cool and deep, smelling faintly of the rain-washed pines outside. Coy stood there for a long moment, the fight completely drained out of his frame. He looked at the retired pastor, locked in his beige, soft chair, and then at Jerry, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing nod. Coy realized then that he hadn't been fighting for an easement or a boundary line. He had been fighting the terrifying, cold realization that the world his grandmother had built was slowly being paved over, and he was helpless to stop it. He'd been waving his hat in the dust, trying to turn the herd. "She is safe, isn't she, preacher?" Coy asked, his voice barely a murmur. "She is," Thomas said, his voice clear and steady in the quiet. Coy let out a long, ragged sigh. He folded the newspaper neatly, laid it on the side table next to the water glass, and reached out to touch Thomas's motionless shoulder. "Thank you, Thomas," Coy said softly. I reckon I'll go home and check on the heifers. Tell Christopher I'm sorry I lost my head." When the screen door clacked shut, gently this time, Jerry stood up and walked over to the side table. He picked up the folded newspaper and tossed it into the wood box, then turned back to the chair. "That was a sweet scoop of feed, Thomas," Jerry said, a rare, bright smile breaking across his dark face. "You didn't have to yell at him once." "He was just thirsty, Jerry," Thomas whispered, his eyes closing as the physical exhaustion of the effort settled deep into his chest. "Most of them are. We have to keep the bucket handy." The core concept: attraction over coercion. The heart of this hour lies in a fundamental shift in understanding of spiritual leadership. In the rural South, a man learns quickly that livestock cannot be bullied into compliance without a massive expenditure of energy and a high risk of chaos. Old Earl Brown, saving Pastor Cone and Thurman Creel from a herd of stampeding heifers using nothing but a red bucket of Arthur Burson's proprietary sweet molasses feed, is the ultimate parable for church work, a legalistic, harsh ministry, one that relies on the whip of shame, fear, or shouting from behind, ultimately fails to move the human heart. True pastoral leadership mimics Earl's red bucket. It offers something so intrinsically sweet, nourishing, and attractive that the flock willingly follows the shepherd anywhere, even through a difficult pasture. Because ALS limits his physical momentum, his leadership has been distilled down to its purest form: gentle encouragement and the quiet dispensation of grace from his chair. The closing reflection. Thomas, thank you for keeping the feed sweet all these years. The people of this valley don't follow you because they have to. They follow you because you've always shown them the gentleness of the shepherd. Rest easy in this room today. The late afternoon sun was cutting flat through the dusty screens of the sunroom, painting long golden ribs across the floorboards. Jerry sat on the edge of the low wooden box, hands resting on his knees, while Thomas lay back in the beige fabric chair, his left hand twitching occasionally, in time with some silent rhythm. "Thomas," Jerry said, his gravelly voice quiet in the warm room, the day Earl Brown walked out into that charging herd with nothing but a red plastic bucket of sweet feed changed the entire blueprint for how you handled the congregation. Looking back, why do you think human beings and deacons respond so much better to a little cane sugar than a loud shout? A slow, genuine smile creased the corners of Thomas's eyes, the memory pulling him back 40 years to a pasture just south of the creek bend. They were 1,200 pounds of pure, stupid panic, Thomas whispered, his voice thick but filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. 24 Hereford cows and a big-shouldered bull, running blind because a backfire from Thurman's truck had spooked them. They were heading straight for the Timber Creek barbed wire. If they hit it at that speed, they'd have torn themselves to ribbons. He stopped to catch his breath, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, deliberate cycle. Jerry didn't rush him. He just waited, his head tilted in attention. "We were all out there," Thomas continued, a low wheeze in his throat. "Me, Roscoe, 3 of the Miller boys. We were jumping up and down, waving our hats, screaming at the top of our lungs to try and turn them. But the louder we yelled, the harder they ran. We were adding our panic to theirs. We became part of the noise." Thomas turned his eyes toward Jerry, the intensity in them bright and focused. And then Earl came out of the barn. He didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked right into the path of that dust cloud, carrying a battered old red plastic bucket. He reached his hand in, scooped up a fistful of that sweet feed, heavy with dark molasses and cane sugar, and he shook the bucket. Chink, chink, chink. Thomas's left fingers tapped once against the beige armrest, mimicking the sound. That smell of sweet molasses hit the air, and that little rattling sound cut right through the roar of the hooves. The lead heifer slowed her gait. The bull dropped his head, sniffing. Within 2 minutes, the whole herd was head down in a neat circle around Earl's boots, licking the sugar right out of his palms. He walked them all the way back to the pen without ever raising his hand. Thomas rested his head back against the soft cushion, looking up at the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above. "It took me 10 years of preaching to realize the church is no different," he said softly. "Human beings, and deacons especially, are mostly just running on panic. They're scared of the world changing, scared of the budget failing, scared of getting old and losing their grip. When a pastor stands behind an oak pulpit and yells at them about their duties or raises his voice to force them through a committee vote, he's just waving his hat in the dust. He's just making them run faster toward the wire. He paused, his eyes drifting back to the window where the first evening crickets were beginning to tune up in the grass. But grace is that red bucket, Jerry. It's got a smell to it that the soul recognizes from a mile off. It's sweet and it's quiet. When you show a stubborn deacon a little genuine kindness, when you listen to his fears instead of shouting over them, you're offering him something his spirit is starving for. You can't drive a man out of his panic with a whip, Jerry, but you can lead him a long way into the light if he knows you're carrying something sweet in your hand. Jerry sat quietly for a long moment, the dark walnut of his face catching the last of the amber light. He reached down, picked up his pocket knife, and gently turned it over in his hand. "That's the truth of it, Thomas," Jerry said, his voice dropping into that deep, rhythmic rumble. "But the trick of the bucket is that you have to have the courage to walk out into the dust to hold it. Earl couldn't feed those cows from behind the fence. He had to stand right where the hooves were flying." Jerry stood up, his tall frame blocking the last of the sun, and walked over to the side of the lift chair. He laid his heavy palm flat against Thomas's shoulder, a steady grounding anchor. "That's what we're doing in here," Jerry said softly. "No waving hats, no shouting at the wind, just shaking the bucket and waiting on the herd to quiet down." Thomas let out a slow, dry breath, the name Arthur Burson bringing a distant, salt-tinged memory into the humid sunroom. Arthur had been a shrimp boat captain down in Mobile before he lost his left hand to a rusted winch and came inland to run a small livery stable near the county line. He was a man who understood the stubbornness of heavy animals and the pull of deep water. Arthur knew the gravity of hunger, Thomas says, his voice thick but deliberate. He knew that a beast doesn't look at the drop-off if its eye is fixed on the sweetness. But these days, we've gotten the mechanics completely backward. We've turned the pulpit into a shouting tower, and we're trying to keep people out of the dark by throwing rocks at them. We think that if we yell loud enough about the water's depth or paint the dock with warnings and harsh rules, we can scare the panic out of them. But all we do is make the edge of the world look like a battleground. When the church joins the shouting match, the salt of the earth turns into bitter brine. The gospel gets sour the second we start using it to win an argument instead of to feed a starving soul. Thomas shifts his head slightly against the headrest, his eyes tracking a beetle crawling slowly along the outer sill. The secret to keeping it sweet is remembering the taste of the sugar ourselves. When a man is drowning in the noise of this world, when the anger on the television beats him up, the division in his family, and the constant demand to choose a side, the last thing he needs is a preacher telling him he's a fool for being thirsty. He needs the raw, unpolished taste of mercy. If we want the gospel to taste sweet again, we have to stop offering people a list of chores to complete before they can come to the table. We have to be the ones standing at the very end of the dock holding the red bucket. We have to show them a kindness so thick and real that it makes the salt water look like exactly what it is. Nothing but a desert. Jerry Wallace, who has been quietly pairing a set of clean socks in the corner, walks over and sets the folded cotton on the chest of drawers. He looks down at Thomas, his dark face caught in the amber glow of the desk lamp. You can't cure a sour stomach with lemon juice, preacher, Jerry says softly, his baritone rumbling in the quiet room. The world is already full of people telling everyone else what they're doing wrong. That's cheap vinegar. It's easy to pour, and it doesn't cost the man pouring it a single thing. Jerry leans his hip against the arm of the lift chair, his massive hand resting on his own denim knee. But sugar has to be cultivated. You got to clear the ground, plant the cane, watch the frost, and squeeze the juice out of the stalk under a heavy wheel. It takes sweat to make something sweet. If we want the folks in this town to taste the grace, we have to be willing to do the heavy pressing ourselves. We got to love them when they're ugly, listen to them when they're wrong, and carry them when they're broken. That's the only way the sweetness gets into the timber. Thomas looks up at Jerry, a quiet, settled peace, smoothing the lines on his forehead. I suppose Arthur had it right, Thomas whispers, his left hand resting still. The beast isn't looking for a lecture on the depth of the sea. It's just looking for the hand that knows how to feed it. The smell of damp cedar and two-cycle engine exhaust hung heavy over the Piney Grove churchyard by 8 o'clock Saturday morning. Christopher Miller stood near the edge of the cemetery ridge, a yellow tape measure clipped to his belt and his legal pad sitting on the tailgate of his truck. He wasn't looking at the measurements for the new tool shed. His eyes were fixed on the gravel turnoff. His shoulders braced every time the sound of an approaching engine rattled down the hollow. He was waiting for the storm. After Coy Higgins' shouting match in his office on Wednesday, Christopher had barely slept. He had spent his nights drafting arguments, looking up county easement laws, and rehearsing firm pastoral rebukes to keep Coy from starting a fistfight with Roscoe Vance in front of the congregation. He had his fence posts lined up, ready to be driven deep into the dirt. A rusted blue F-150 rounded the curve, its tailpipe coughing a dark cloud of blue smoke. Christopher's stomach tightened. It was Coy. The truck pulled up next to the cemetery gate and died with a loud shudder. For a long moment, the driver's side door stayed shut. Christopher took a slow, steadying breath, stepping away from the tailgate to meet him before Coy could reach the other men gathering by the sanctuary steps. When the door finally creaked open, Coy didn't storm out. He climbed down slowly, his boots hitting the gravel without the usual aggressive stamp. He was wearing his clean work khakis, and instead of a wrench or a sign, he was carrying a large grease-stained cardboard box from the back of his truck. The scent of warm lard, black pepper, and cane syrup reached Christopher before Coy did. Christopher stopped 5 feet away, his hands flat at his sides. "Morning, Coy." Coy didn't look up immediately. He adjusted his grip on the box, his rough thumb tracing the edge of the folded cardboard. "Preacher," Coy said. His voice wasn't hot. It was quiet, carrying the flat, gravelly cadence of a man who had spent the night thinking in an empty house. "Brought some sausage and egg biscuits from the crossroads. Still warm. Figure the boys working on the cemetery fence could use some grease before the sun gets high." Christopher blinked, his mind spinning, the rehearsed speeches in his head suddenly looking like dry leaves in a windstorm. "Coy, I thought after Wednesday, I thought you were going to—" "I was." Coy cut him off gently. He finally looked up, his eyes clear and tired, but completely devoid of the red-faced fury from 3 days ago. "I was going to tear the shingles off the roof, but I went down to the parsonage yesterday. Talked to Thomas." Christopher's hand went instinctively to the pocket where his pen was tucked. "Thomas?" "Yeah," Coy said, looking past Christopher's shoulder toward the quiet ridge where his grandmother May lay under the cedar shade. "He reminded me of some things. Reminded me that the ground under her headstone doesn't belong to the county commission, and it doesn't belong to the loggers. The Lord's got her marked down, and a 3-axle diesel truck can't shake that loose." Coy stepped forward, offering the box. The warmth of the cardboard pressed into Christopher's palms as he took it. "I'm sorry I came at you so hard, Christopher," Coy said softly, his voice dropping into a register Christopher hadn't heard from him in 3 years of ministry. "You're a young man, and you're trying to keep the peace. I was scared of the world getting smaller, I reckon. But Thomas showed me that the pasture's still wide open. We don't need to fight the trucks to keep the grace." Coy gave Christopher's shoulder one firm, brief squeeze, the same gesture Thurman Creel had used the week before, then turned and walked toward the tool shed, calling out a quiet, "Morning, boys," to the Miller brothers who were unloading the shovels. Christopher stood by the tailgate, holding the heavy box of biscuits. He looked down at the grease soaking through the cardboard, then turned his head toward the parsonage down the road. The sun was hitting the sunroom windows, turning the glass into a sheet of brilliant, reflective gold. He realized then that Thomas hadn't built a single defense against Coy's anger. He hadn't quoted the church bylaws or argued about the legal boundaries of the cemetery plots. He just walked out into the charging herd, shaking the red bucket, and let the sweetness do the work. Christopher set the box on the tailgate, opened the lid, and pulled out a warm biscuit, the grease staining his fingers. He took a bite, the salt and molasses filling his mouth, and for the first time since he had taken the pulpit at Piney Grove, he let his shoulders drop. The fence was still broken, but the sheep were safe. The glass and the dirt. The sunroom was built for light, so it was made of glass. 12 large double-hung panes enclosed Thomas on 3 sides, framing the gravel driveway, the red clay path to the sanctuary, and the long sloping pasture ridge where the pines met the sky. To Thomas, those panes had become his entire relationship with Piney Grove. He sat in the center of them like a specimen in a jar. When the deacon board came by, They stood outside on the grass first, talking in low voices, their silhouettes pressed against the glass before they ever knocked. When Thurman Creel parked his tractor by the ditch line, Thomas watched him through the eastern pane, a silent movie of a man working a wrench. The glass kept the dust out and the cold out, but it also kept the world at a perfect, untouchable distance. One afternoon, after the sun had dipped behind the ridge and left the room in a cool blue shadow, Jerry Wallace walked in to adjust the leg rests on the lift chair. "Jerry," Thomas whispered, his voice thick and slow, "you ever notice the glass?" Jerry didn't look up from the metal pins of the footrest. "I clean it every Tuesday, Thomas. I notices the smudges." "No," Thomas said, his left hand twitching on the beige fabric chair. "The separation. For 50 years, I had a window between me and the folks. The pulpit was a window. My collar was a window. People could look in, but they couldn't touch the preacher. Now this room is nothing but glass. I have only windows." Jerry finished setting the pen with a sharp clack, then stood up straight, his tall frame blocking the blue light of the northern pane. He wiped his hands on a dry rag, his dark eyes looking down at Thomas with that flat, unvarnished honesty that never offered any pity. "You got windows to the town, Thomas," Jerry said, his low baritone filling the quiet room, "but you ain't got a single window to me." Thomas shifted his eyes up toward him. "Why is that, Jerry?" "Because a window is for things you want to keep clean," Jerry said, leaning his shoulder against the wooden frame of the door. "A window is so you can watch the storm blow without having to smell the wet dirt or feel the wind sting your face. It's for people who want to look at the work without getting grease on their cuffs. When Roscoe or Christopher comes in here, they're still looking at you through the glass of who you used to be. They want the picture frame version of the old pastor who had all the answers. They need that window, Thomas, because if they look too close at the raw truth of this disease, it frightens them. It makes their knees feel weak. But you and me, we don't have the luxury of glass." Jerry walked over to the side of the chair, his large, rough hand reaching down to adjust the heavy canvas sling tucked beneath Thomas's thighs. There was no hesitation in his touch, no polite distance. He felt the heat of Thomas's skin, the stiffness of the locked joints, and the slight, involuntary tremble of the muscles. "You don't put a window between the yoke and the ox, preacher," Jerry said softly, his face inches from Thomas's. "You don't put glass between two men trying to haul a logged oak out of the creek bed. I know when your chest is tight before you even cough. I know your exact weight when we do the transfer, and you know the strength of my back when I lift you. There ain't no room for a pane of glass between the harness and the man holding the rope." Jerry stood up, tossing the rag onto the side table next to the water glass. "The Lord gave you 12 windows so you could keep watching over the herd, Thomas," Jerry said, a rare, quiet warmth settling into his gravelly voice. "But he didn't put any between us, because down here in the dirt, where the real work gets done, you've got to be able to reach out and grab hold of the iron. Glass doesn't do nothing but break when you put your weight on it. Thomas lay back against the headrest, his breathing deep and regular. He looked at the 12 panes of glass surrounding him, reflecting the first evening stars in the darkening sky. They felt less like a cage now and more like a simple boundary. Outside of the world was a picture. But inside, where Jerry's heavy boots squeaked against the linoleum, the reality was warm, solid, and entirely undivided. The twilight had settled thick and blue over the sunroom, turning the pine trees outside into black silhouettes against the sky. Near the screen door stood 3 heavy cardboard boxes, neatly taped across the top, the first real proof that 50 years in the parsonage were coming to a close. Jerry was kneeling by the wood box, wiping down the rubber wheels of the transport chair with an oily rag. His big hands worked with slow, steady rhythm, the metal squeaking softly under the pressure. Thomas sat still in the beige lift chair, watching the dust catch in the weave of Jerry's denim shirt. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of the crickets out in the ditch line. "Jerry," Thomas whispered, his voice falling low, barely carrying past the armrest. Jerry didn't stop wiping the wheel, but his ears turned toward the chair. "I'm listening, preacher." "The home," Thomas said, gathering a shallow breath into his chest. "Next week." "I know," Jerry said smoothly, setting the rag on the edge of the wood box. "Christopher's got the maintenance boys clearing out the sunroom on the east wing. It's got a good view of the oak grove, plenty of light." Thomas shook his head slightly, a small, stiff fraction of an inch against the canvas headrest. "Not just the room, Jerry." Jerry stopped. He sat back on his heels, his heavy forearms resting across his knees, looking up at Thomas and the dim brass light of the desk lamp. Thomas looked straight into Jerry's eyes, his own burning with an uncompromising, absolute clarity that the disease couldn't touch. He tightened his throat, pushing the river gravel of his consonants flat so the words came out raw and clean. "I need you to come with me." The cicadas outside seemed to pause in the sweet gums. Jerry didn't blink. He just held Thomas's gaze, his dark face unreadable in the shadows. "They got nurses down there, Thomas," Jerry said quietly, his low baritone testing the weight of the request. "They got young girls in scrubs who know how to turn a bed and read a chart." "They got nurses," Thomas whispered, his breathing shallow. "They don't got a colleague." He paused, gathering every ounce of strength left in his chest. His left fingers twitched on the armrest, trying to reach across the small space between them. When he spoke again, he lowered his voice to a soft, rustling murmur, saying straight to Jerry the exact truth he had already told Christopher Roscoe and his daughters. "Jerry, you are good to me and for me." The words hung in the quiet sunroom, heavy as heartwood. They weren't a compliment, and they weren't a polite expression of thanks. They were a recognition of covenant, the acknowledgement that whatever grace was keeping Thomas anchored in the dirt was passing through the hands and breath of the man sitting on his heels beside him. Jerry stood up slowly, his tall frame blocking out the blue light of the window. He walked over to the side of the lift chair, reached down, and took Thomas's stiffened left hand into his own massive warm palm, closing his rough fingers gently around the pastor's knuckles. You think I was going to let you go down to that nursing home alone and let those town folks talk over top of you? Jerry asked softly, a rare, deep crease appearing at the corner of his eye. Who's going to translate your thunder when you tell the director his fences are too small? Thomas let out a long, trailing breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches into the soft cushion as a profound, unshakable peace settled over his face. So, you're coming? Thomas whispered. Where the ox goes, the harness goes, Chaplain, Jerry said, his voice anchoring the quiet room like an iron stake driven into red clay. We got 40 souls down on that wing, waiting to hear what the Lord looks like when the walls fall. I'll pack my tools in the morning. Would you like to draft the scene of their arrival at the Piney Grove nursing home as Jerry rolls Thomas into his new office? Or should we explore how the nursing home staff reacts to Jerry's presence? The digital clock on the bedside table read 2:14 a.m. At this hour, the Piney Grove nursing home operated on a different frequency. The daytime noise of television sets and pill carts was replaced by the low hum of the vending machine down the hall and the slow, rhythmic squeak of a floor buffer 3 corridors over. In the East Wing sunroom, the door was wide open, just as Thomas had ordered. A single amber reading lamp cast a warm, low circle of light across the linoleum. Thomas was awake in his adjustable bed, the back raised to a 30-degree angle so he could watch the dark glass of the windows. Jerry Wallace was sitting on the radiator cover, a worn, pocket-sized New Testament open on his knee, though he wasn't reading it. He was listening to the hallway. Footsteps approached, heavy, dragging, and out of rhythm. A young night orderly named Marcus stopped in the doorway. He was 22, wearing faded blue scrubs, and he looked like a man who had just run 10 miles with a cinder block on his chest. He leaned his head against the door frame, looking into the dim room. Office still open? Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly. Door's open, ain't it? Jerry said softly, not moving from the radiator. Come on in and sit down, son. Marcus walked over to the wicker chair and collapsed into it. He dropped his face into his hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent, heavy tremor. For 5 long minutes, the only sound in the room was the young man's ragged breathing and the quiet whir of Thomas's oxygen concentrator. Thomas didn't try to speak. He lay perfectly still, practicing the heavy, difficult work of his mother's plaque. He offered Marcus the unhurried grace of 2 ears. When Marcus finally looked up, his eyes were red and wet. Mr. Henderson in room 412 just passed, he whispered. I was holding his hand. His daughter was supposed to be here, but she got stuck in Atlanta with car trouble. He was terrified, Pastor. He kept asking if the water was deep. I didn't know what to tell him. I just kept saying, you're okay, you're okay. But he wasn't okay. He was dying. Marcus gripped the arms of the wicker chair, his knuckles turning white. I can't carry this anymore, Marcus choked out. I thought this job was about helping people heal, but all I do is watch the lights go out one by one. I feel like I'm supposed to be holding them back from the edge, but my hands ain't strong enough. The dark keeps winning. Thomas looked at the young orderly. He gathered the shallow air in his chest, his eyes filled with a fierce, ancient compassion. He willed his jaw to work, forcing his tongue against the roof of his mouth. You ain't the root, Thomas whispered, the words scraping like iron across the stone. He took another ragged breath. You are just the leaf. Marcus blinked, staring at the old pastor, clearly desperate for the comfort, but unable to cross the bridge of Thomas's broken syllables. The root? From the shadows by the window, Jerry closed his New Testament with a soft thud. He stood up, his tall frame moving slowly into the amber light of the lamp. He didn't look at the medical charts, and he didn't offer a clinical platitude. He looked right at Marcus, stepping fully into the yoke of the chaplaincy. The chaplain's saying you've got the blueprint entirely backward, Marcus, Jerry said, his deep baritone rolling through the quiet room like a low clap of summer thunder. You think you're the root of the tree. You think it's your job to hold the timber up, to keep the dirt from washing away, and to pull the life out of the ground, to keep these folks breathing. Prophet Jerry walked over and placed his heavy, calloused hand on the back of Marcus's chair. But you ain't the root, son, Jerry continued, his voice dropping into a register of profound, unshakable certainty. You're just a leaf on the branch. Your job ain't to hold the tree up. Your job is to catch a little bit of the sunlight and pass it down the line. That's it. Marcus looked up at Jerry, a fresh tear tracking down his cheek. But he was so scared, Prophet Wallace. He asked if the water was deep. And you sat there and held his hand, Jerry said, his grip tightening slightly on the wicker chair to anchor the young man. You think you failed because he still crossed over, but you didn't fail. You did exactly what you were put in that room to do. When a man is stepping off the bank into the river, he don't need you to drain the water. He needs to know he ain't standing on the muddy bank by himself. You ain't the one doing the saving, Marcus. The Lord is the one standing in the deep water, waiting to catch him. You're just the one holding the lantern on the porch so he can see the path down to the creek. Jerry leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto the young orderlies. Stop trying to fight the dark like it's your job to beat it, Jerry murmured. The dark is just the time of day when the shepherd brings the sheep back to the barn. Don't carry the weight of the gate. Just hold the lantern. Marcus let out a long, shuddering sigh. The rigid, terrified tension that had been holding his spine completely shattered, leaving him slumped but breathing deeply, as if a 200-pound iron weight had been lifted off his chest. He looked from Jerry to Thomas, who was watching him with a quiet, affirming nod. Just hold the lantern, Marcus whispered to himself, the words settling into his mind. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and stood up. He looked lighter. Thank you, both of you. I need to go check on 414. Door's always open, Marcus, Jerry said. When the orderly slipped back into the hallway, his footsteps were no longer dragging. They were quiet and steady. Jerry walked back over to the radiator, picking up his New Testament. He looked over at Thomas, who was smiling, a faint, true smile that reached all the way to the corners of his tired eyes. That was a good answer, Prophet Wallace, Thomas whispered into the dim room. Jerry sat down, leaning his broad back against the wall, his eyes returning to the dark window. I just read the weather, Chaplain. You're the one who called the rain. Jerry, if I've told you this story, listen, I need to hear it again. It's the man by the window. It's not from the Bible, but it's been shared in sermons and devotionals for years because of its message. Two men were patients in the same hospital room. One man's bed was positioned next to the only window, while the other man had to lie flat on his back all day and could not see outside. Each afternoon, the man by the window would sit up for an hour and describe to his roommate everything he could see outside. He spoke of a beautiful park with a sparkling lake. Ducks and swans played on the water, and children sailed their toy boats. Young couples walked hand in hand among flowers of every color. Tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, and beyond them, he said, was a view of the city skyline. The man in the other bed began to live for those 1 hour moments. His world was expanded by all the activity and beauty his roommate described. He pictured it vividly in his mind, and yet over time, something changed in him. Instead of gratitude, envy crept in. Why should he have the window? He thought. I deserve that view too. One night, the man by the window began to cough and struggle for breath. He reached for the call button, but the other man watched and said nothing. Eventually, the coughing stopped. In the morning, the nurses found that the man by the window had died. Soon after, the surviving man asked if he could be moved to the bed by the window. The nurses agreed and moved him there. With great effort, he slowly raised himself, eager at last to see the beauty he had heard about for so long. But when he looked out the window, all he saw was a blank brick wall. Confused, he asked the nurse, how could my roommate describe such wonderful things outside this window? The nurse replied gently, your roommate was blind. He couldn't see the wall. He just wanted to encourage you. The point hits pretty deep. Some people create beauty for others even when they can't see it themselves. Envy can blind us more than any physical limitation. And sometimes the greatest gift isn't what we see, but what we give. The fire code, by Thursday, the East Wing sunroom had ceased to be a high observation care unit. It had become a sanctuary. It started with Miss Clara in her wicker chair, but word moved through the Piney Grove nursing home faster than the morning medication cart. Soon, Mr. Henderson's roommate, a retired mechanic named Silas, was rolling his wheelchair down to sit by the glass. Then came Mrs. Abernathy, carrying a faded photograph of her grandson. They didn't always talk, Sometimes they just sat in the square patches of autumn sunlight, anchored by the quiet, steady presence of the old pastor who couldn't move his legs, but whose eyes missed absolutely nothing. At 10:15 a.m., the heavy, rubber-soled squeak of authority marched down the linoleum corridor. It was Director Caldwell. He wore his suits a little too tight across the shoulders and viewed the nursing home strictly through the lens of liability matrices and state inspection codes. He was flanked by Nurse Brenda, who looked deeply uncomfortable. Caldwell stopped in the doorway, staring at the impromptu congregation. Silas was asleep in his wheelchair. Clara was humming a soft, tuneless hymn. Jerry Wallace sat on the radiator cover, carefully whittling a small block of cedar over a trash can. "Mr. Wallace," Caldwell said, his voice loud and clipped, designed to clear the room, "this has to stop. Right now." Jerry didn't look up. He blew a cedar shaving off his knife blade. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell. The chaplain's got a full waiting room today." "He is not a chaplain here. He is a resident," Caldwell snapped, stepping into the room. He pointed a rigid finger toward Silas. "This sunroom is not zoned for general congregation. You are blocking a designated fire exit. You're disrupting the medication schedule. And frankly, you are creating an unmanageable liability. I'm shutting this down." Caldwell reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the fire door, and pulled it toward him, intending to close the sunroom off from the hallway. The door moved exactly 3 inches before it stopped with a dull, heavy thud. Jerry hadn't seemed to move fast, but his large, spotless tennis shoe was wedged perfectly against the bottom of the door frame. He stood up, towering over the administrator. He didn't raise his hands and he didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at Caldwell with eyes that had stared down angry bulls and swollen creek beds. "The door stays open, Director," Jerry said, his baritone rumbling low in his chest. "Mr. Wallace, remove your foot," Caldwell demanded, his face flushing red, "or I will have orderlies remove you from this facility." From the center of the room, Thomas took a sharp, shallow breath. The sound of his oxygen concentrator seemed to pause. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas whispered. The voice was thin, ruined by the ALS, but it carried the unmistakable, forged iron authority of a man who had commanded the Piney Grove pulpit for half a century. Caldwell froze, his hand still on the brass handle, and looked at the older adult in the lift chair. Thomas forced his jaw to work. He looked at the administrator, not with anger, but with a deep, piercing pity. "You are building a perfect barn," Thomas breathed, the words dragging like heavy stones. "But you are starving the sheep." Caldwell frowned, his bureaucratic mind struggling to process the metaphor. "Excuse me, Reverend Cone, we have state guidelines." Jerry leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, keeping his boot firmly in place. "The chaplain is saying, your ledger looks real clean, Mr. Caldwell," Jerry translated, his voice perfectly matching the cadence of Thomas's breathing. You got your fire codes, your liability charts, and your medication schedules. You built a perfect safe box, but you forgot that the people living inside it are dying of the cold. Jerry gestured with his pocket knife towards Silas, who had woken up and was watching the exchange with wide eyes, and then to Miss Clara. These folks didn't come down here to block a fire exit, Jerry said softly. They came down here because it's the only room in this whole building that doesn't smell like waiting to die. They came down here for the light. I cannot allow unauthorized gatherings, Caldwell insisted, though his voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by a defensive waver. If state comes in here and sees this, let them come, Thomas whispered, his left fingers twitching against the armrest. He locked eyes with Caldwell. Tell the state the chaplain takes the weight. Jerry nodded slowly. You heard the man, Director. If the state inspectors write you up, you tell them Dr. Thomas Cone ordered the door open. You tell them you tried to close it, but the resident chaplain overruled you. Put it right there on your liability chart. Caldwell looked at Thomas. He looked at Jerry's immovable boot. Then he looked at Nurse Brenda, who was standing in the hallway. Brenda wasn't writing anything down. She was watching, and to Caldwell's horror, she gave a very slight, almost imperceptible nod of agreement with the men in the room. Caldwell realized he was completely outmatched. He couldn't physically move Jerry, and he couldn't morally outmaneuver Thomas without looking like a tyrant in front of his own nursing staff. He let go of the brass handle. If a single piece of medical equipment is blocked, Caldwell stammered, adjusting his suit jacket, I will have this room cleared immediately, and I want this floor swept of those wood shavings, Mr. Wallace. Yes, sir, Jerry said smoothly, pulling his boot back and letting the door swing wide open again. Have a blessed morning, Director. Caldwell turned on his heel and marched quickly back down the corridor, the squeak of his shoes fading into the distance. The sunroom was quiet again. Silas let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Miss Clara went back to humming her hymn. Jerry walked back over to the radiator, picked up his block of cedar, and sat down. He looked over at Thomas, who had closed his eyes, exhausted from the physical toll of the confrontation, but wearing a look of profound, settled peace. Well, Chaplain, Jerry rumbled, a slow smile breaking across his dark face. Looks like the fire code just got rewritten for the East Wing. Thomas kept his eyes closed, drawing in a slow, sweet breath of the autumn air coming through the cracked glass. Leave the shavings on the floor, Jerry, Thomas whispered into the sunlight. Let him smell the wood. Jerry leaned back in the creaking rocker, staring down at his hands before looking over at the silent screen resting on Pastor Cone's lap. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind built over 30 years of shared potlucks, hospital visits, and late-night deacon meetings. You know, Pastor, Jerry said softly, his voice carrying the rasp of a man trying to talk around a lump in his throat. I was reading up on it again last night. All those medical terms, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, I can barely pronounce it, let alone make sense of why a man like you gets slapped with a label like that. Pastor Cone didn't move his head, but his eyes lit up with that familiar, mischievous spark. Slowly, deliberately, his right thumb tapped against the screen of his tablet. The digital cursor blinked once, twice, 3 times as he constructed his reply. A soft chime signaled the thought was complete. The clone voice spoke, steady and even through the small speaker. The doctors gave me their words, Jerry, but they don't get the final say on what things mean. Jerry chuckled, shaking his head. Suppose you'd have an opinion on the doctor's diagnosis. Pastor Cone's thumb moved across the glass again. ALS, 3 letters. Everyone hears them and thinks of a medical sentence. Jerry watched the screen, waiting. The long pauses between sentences had become their own form of punctuation, forcing every word to carry weight. The tablet chimed again. To me, ALS has a different meaning. It stands for a long shadow. Jerry paused, setting his coffee mug down on the end table. A long shadow? Cone gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his eyes toward the window, where the tall pines outside cast dark, elongated silhouettes across the lawn in the setting sun. He typed again, the faint click of glass filling the room. When a man stands in the sun, Jerry, a shadow stretches out behind him. The taller the oak, the longer the shadow it casts across the grass. People look at this chair and think the darkness is swallowing me up. But you can't have a shadow without a bright light standing right behind you. Jerry sat still, listening as the synthetic voice carried words that felt entirely human. This disease is just a shadow, Jerry. It's long and it reaches across the whole church and the whole town, but it only exists because the light on the other side is so blindingly real. Don't fear the shadow. Just look at what's making it. Jerry wiped a hand down his face, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. He looked across at his friend, body immobilized, voice quieted, yet spirits completely untouched. A long shadow? Jerry whispered, a faint smile breaking through. Leave it to you, Pastor, to find a sermon in an acronym. Prophet Wallace, you know, I have those manure pile days when nothing goes well. Those days, ALS stands for a live skunk, and it stinks to high heavens. The tablet chimed one last time, crisp and quick. That'll be $10 for the pastoral counseling session. Put it in the offering plate on Sunday. The Tuesday afternoon sunroom was quiet, save for the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator in the next room and the occasional heavy sigh of Pastor Cone. In the fellowship hall across the gravel parking lot, the Piney Grove Finance Committee was entering its 3rd hour of debating whether to replace the church van or pray over its transmission one more time. Cone, blessedly exempt from attendance by doctor's orders, sat in his wheelchair with his new high-tech communication tablet propped in his lap. The tablet was equipped with an advanced artificial intelligence assistant. The manual promised it could answer complex queries, synthesize medical research, and facilitate seamless global communication. Cone just wanted to settle a grudge using the eye tracking software. He slowly typed a prompt into the AI search bar, his right eyebrow arched in quiet anticipation. Prompt: conduct a comprehensive medical review. Is there a direct, scientifically proven link between amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, and prolonged unshielded exposure to church deacons? The screen pulsed with soft blue ring as the AI thought about it. A few seconds later, the sterile, perfectly polite text appeared on the screen, accompanied by its synthetic voice. AI: no, there is no scientific evidence or medical literature linking amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, to exposure to church deacons, religious committees, or any specific occupational hazards related to clergy work. ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease primarily affecting motor neurons. Cone rolled his eyes. The machine lacked imagination. He meticulously drafted his rebuttal. Prompt: your database is clearly incomplete. Please cross-reference spinal cord degeneration with the Piney Grove Building Fund Committee of 1998. I sat through a 4-hour debate on whether the fellowship hall carpet should be dusty rose or mauve. I am almost certain my motor neurons began protesting that very evening. The blue ring pulsed slightly longer this time. AI: I have searched available medical and historical databases. I cannot find any peer-reviewed studies evaluating the neurological impact of dusty rose versus mauve carpeting. However, prolonged periods of sitting in high-stress environments can lead to temporary muscle stiffness and fatigue. This is not ALS. Prompt: are you factoring in Brother Jerry? Jerry has a unique ability to ask a question right as the meeting is being dismissed, thus extending the meeting by another 45 minutes. Surely modern science has classified this as an environmental toxin. AI: Brother Jerry is not recognized as an environmental toxin by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, or the World Health Organization, WHO. If you are experiencing distress due to interpersonal conflicts, psychologists recommend setting clear boundaries or practicing mindfulness. A dry, wheezing chuckle escaped Cone's throat. Mindfulness. Try being mindful when the HVAC committee is arguing about the thermostat settings in the sanctuary. He moved his eyes across the keyboard again, leaning into the bit. Prompt: I am paralyzed from the neck down. My boundaries are currently set by whoever locks the wheels on this chair. Let us try another variable. Calculate the exact physiological toll of eating 72 consecutive varieties of cream of mushroom casseroles brought over by the hospitality committee since my diagnosis. The AI paused for a full 10 seconds. AI: excessive consumption of condensed soups can lead to elevated sodium levels, which may cause hypertension, water retention, and lethargy. While this does not cause ALS, it is highly recommended that you incorporate fresh vegetables into your diet. Prompt, you don't understand Piney Grove. The green beans in the casserole are the fresh vegetables. Look, machine, I need you to officially state that the deacon board sped up my decline so I can have the tablet read it aloud at the next business meeting. AI, I cannot fulfill this request as it violates safety guidelines against generating medical misinformation. ALS is an idiopathic disease in 90% of cases, meaning the exact cause is unknown. Cone stared at the screen. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Prompt, idiopathic, meaning doctors have no idea what causes it. AI, that is correct. The exact origins remain a mystery to modern medicine. Prompt. So, what you're telling me is that science cannot definitively prove that it wasn't the deacons. The tablet screen froze. The blue circle spun round and round, glitching slightly as the algorithm struggled to process the sheer gravity of Southern pastoral logic. Finally, the text appeared. AI. Technically, science cannot definitively prove a negative. However, Cone didn't let it finish. He hit the Save to Favorites button. Just then, the front door to the parsonage creaked open, and Jerry walked into the sunroom, holding a Tupperware container. Hey, Pastor, committee meeting finally wrapped up. Figured I'd bring you some leftover potato salad. Cone's eyes darted to the tablet. He triggered his newly saved response. The mechanical voice cut through the quiet room with pristine digital authority. Technically, science cannot definitively prove that you didn't cause this, Jerry. Jerry stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the tablet and then up at Cone. The pastor sat perfectly still, but his eyes were dancing with absolute, unbridled triumph. The late evening rain was drumming a steady, familiar rhythm against the aluminum awning of the parsonage porch. Inside, the only light came from the small amber lamp on the end table and the pale blue glow of Pastor Cone's communication tablet. Jerry Wallace was moving quietly around the room, the embodiment of a caregiver's quiet liturgy. He adjusted the angle of the wheelchair's headrest, smoothed out the quilt draped over Cone's unmoving legs, and checked the charge on the tablet's battery bank. Cone's eyes tracked Jerry's movements. Slowly, his thumb found the screen. Tap, click, dot. The electronic voice broke the quiet of the room. I used to think my highest calling was preaching from the book of John. Now my highest calling seems to be letting you adjust my socks without complaining. Jerry paused, a half smile breaking across his weathered face. He didn't look up from smoothing the quilt. You used to complain a lot more when you had a voice to do it with, Pastor. The Lord just gave us all a merciful volume control. Cone's right eye gave that familiar sharp twitch. His thumb moved again, but the rhythm was slower this time, heavier. It feels wrong, Jerry. The way of the shepherd is to lead the flock, to carry the weak ones, fend off the wolves, and walk out front. Look at me. I am the weakest sheep in the pasture. I am entirely at the mercy of the wolves. I am not pasturing anyone from this chair. Jerry stood up slowly. He wiped his hands on his denim jeans and looked down at the man who had baptized his children and buried his parents. When Jerry spoke, the casual banter of the caregiver dropped away, replaced by the heavy, undeniable cadence of a man who sees things as they truly are in the spiritual realm. The prophet in Jerry Wallace took the floor. Jerry Wallace: "You're looking at the pasture all wrong, Pastor." Jerry pulled up the wooden rocking chair and sat down, leaning forward so he was at eye level with Cone. Jerry Wallace: "You think the only way a shepherd leads is by walking ahead of the flock into the green pastures? Any hired hand can do that. It doesn't take a calling to lead folks toward still waters when the sun is shining." Jerry pointed a thick, calloused finger at the wheelchair. Jerry Wallace: "But this right here, this is the valley of the shadow of death. The flock doesn't just need to know how to walk in the light, they need to know how to walk into the dark without losing their minds and losing their faith. They need to know what a man looks like when everything is stripped away and only God is left." Cone's thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly, but he didn't type. He just listened. Jerry Wallace: "You think you aren't pastoring, Pastor? You are delivering the most profound sermon of your life, and you haven't spoken a single word out loud in 6 months. You are showing this town how to suffer with dignity. You are showing them how to accept help without losing your pride. You're showing them that the Lord's grace is sufficient even when the body is failing. That is the way of the shepherd, Cone. You aren't just walking through the valley, you're mapping it out for the rest of us." The rain continued to tap against the window pane. The silence in the room stretched out thick and holy. Finally, Cone's eyes dropped back to his screen. The clicking of his thumb seemed a little more deliberate, a little more grounded. "When did the deacon board authorize you to start acting like an Old Testament prophet, Jerry Wallace?" Jerry chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest as he stood back up to check the lock on the wheelchair's brakes. Jerry Wallace: "Oh, I ain't a prophet, Pastor. I'm just a guy making sure your wheels don't roll backward into the television set. But even a donkey can speak the truth if the Lord opens its mouth. Now, do you want me to turn on the Braves game, or are we going to sit here and be overly spiritual all night?" Cone's eyes crinkled at the corners. He tapped a single pre-programmed button on the tablet. "Turn on the game and fix my left sock. You missed a wrinkle. The sanctuary in beige." The morning sun always hit the eastern windows of the parsonage sunroom first, spilling a pool of warm, golden light across the hardwood floor. In the exact center of that light sat Pastor Cone's soft, beige lift chair. To the untrained eye, it looked like standard-issue geriatric furniture, plush, utilitarian, and taking up far too much space. But in the theology of Pastor Cone's final chapter, that chair was the holiest ground in Piney Grove. Jerry walked in carrying 2 mugs of black coffee, setting one on the side table beside the chair with a carefully placed bendable straw. He began tidying up the stack of books on the windowsill. Martha Higgins called this morning, Jerry said, his back turned as he straightened a copy of C.S. Lewis. Said her brother-in-law has a pristine, fully mechanical hospital bed he's not using anymore. She offered to have the men bring it over and set it up right here in the sunroom, give you a bit more lumbar support, she says. Pastor Cohn's right hand rested on the arm of the beige chair. His thumb twitched, finding the screen of his tablet. Tap, click, dot. Jerry didn't turn around, but he stopped wiping the windowsill, waiting for the electronic chime. Tell Martha Higgins that I am a pastor, not a patient, and I will not hold court from a mattress. Jerry chuckled, finally turning to face the chair. I figured you'd say that. I told her we were doing just fine with the beige lounger, though I gotta admit, Pastor, this thing is about the size of a minivan. You sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in something a little more clinical? Cohn's eyes narrowed slightly in mock offense. His thumb went back to work, the deliberate rhythm echoing in the quiet, sunlit room. This chair is not furniture, Jerry. It is a command center, a sanctuary. Jerry pulled up a wooden stool and sat down with his coffee. All right, explain the theology of the beige lift chair, Pastor. I'm listening. The screen paused as Cohn constructed his thought, taking his time to get the words exactly right. The room was perfectly still, save for the faint sound of a lawnmower a mile down the road. When your body stops moving, the world shrinks very quickly. First, it shrinks to a town, then to a house, then to a single room. If you aren't careful, the four walls will crush your spirit before the disease ever finishes your body. But this room and this chair, this is where I fought back. Jerry looked around the sunroom. It had floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, offering an unbroken view of the pine trees, the sprawling lawn, and the vast open Alabama sky. The tablet chimed again. This is my sacred and safe place. I am anchored here in this soft beige cushion, but from this exact spot, I connect with both inner and outer space perfectly. Outer space? Jerry asked, an eyebrow raised. You planning on launching that chair into orbit? A short, wheezing breath that served as Cohn's laughter escaped his chest. Look out the glass, Jerry. That is my outer space. I watch the thunderstorms roll in over the ridge. I watch the seasons turn the leaves. I am entirely safe in here, untouched by the wind or the cold, but I am still a witness to the sheer, massive expanse of God's creation. I haven't lost the world. I have a permanent window seat to it. Cohn paused, his thumb resting on the glass screen for a moment before he continued. In the inner space, that is even larger. In this chair, there's nowhere to run, no errands to run, no sermons to rush off to. The stillness forces you inward, down into the deep waters of the soul. In this chair, my body is entirely broken, but my inner space has never been wider, clearer, or closer to the Spirit. Jerry took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the weight of the words settle over the room. He realized suddenly why he always felt a strange urge to take off his baseball cap whenever he walked through the French doors into this specific room. You know, Jerry said quietly, I've noticed something about the folks who come to visit you, the deacons, the choir ladies, even the mayor. They walk up the front steps talking 100 miles an hour, all stressed out about church budgets or town politics. But the second they step onto the rug in this sunroom, they change. Jerry gestured toward the empty chairs arranged in a neat half circle facing the beige lift chair. Their voices drop, Jerry continued. Their shoulders come down. It's like they cross the border and suddenly realize they aren't in Piney Grove anymore. Cone's eyes softened. A deep, profound peace settled over his face as his thumb tapped out his final thought for the morning. They aren't out there. The world is chaotic, loud, and moving entirely too fast. But in here, time moves at the speed of a blinking cursor and a slow breath. When they cross that threshold, they are entering my sanctuary. The tablet let out a final soft chime. They are welcome to my world, and in my world we sit still, we look at the light, and we realize we are entirely safe. This is the world that placed Needle in me. This place and space is not Trustville, aka Piney Grove, but Trustville, because God placed us here for this season. Jerry nodded slowly, looking at the beige chair, then out the expansive glass windows, and finally back to his friend. It's a good world, Pastor, Jerry whispered, standing up to check the bendable straw in Cone's coffee. It's a mighty good world. The rhythm of the needle. In Piney Grove, they didn't just call her Willeen. To the sewing circles, the grieving mothers, and the children with torn Sunday trousers, she was known simply as Needle Cone. It was a nickname earned through 50 years of holding things together. If Pastor Cone was the booming voice of the church, Needle was the quiet, relentless stitch that kept the seams of the community from fraying. She was a living, breathing Proverbs 31 woman. Her hands were never idle. They were always pulling a thread through denim, knitting a prayer shawl for the oncology ward, or resting gently on the shoulder of a widow. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. But the true measure of Needle's life wasn't found in the garment she made. It was found in the heavy, sacred lifting described in Ecclesiastes 4:9-10. Two are better than one. If either of them falls, one can help the other up. When the long shadow of ALS entered the parsonage, Pastor Cone began to fall. First, it was a stumble in the hallway, then the loss of his legs, and finally, the complete tethering to his beige lift chair. Through it all, Needle was the one who caught him, braced him, and lifted him. To do that kind of holy, back-breaking work, a woman needs a song. Needle's most important song wasn't one she ever sang behind a microphone or in the church choir loft. It was a song lived out in the quiet, unseen spaces of the parsonage. Her anthem was an old, weathered hymn hummed under her breath while the rest of the world was sleeping. Leaning on the everlasting arms. Before the diagnosis, she used to sing it cheerfully while washing dishes, a bouncy, upbeat tune about spiritual fellowship. But as the ALS progressed, the song slowed down. It lost its bounce and took on the deep, grounded rhythm of a caregiver's heartbeat. What a fellowship! What a joy divine! Leaning on the everlasting arms. She hummed it when she had to lock her knees and wrap her arms around her husband's waist to transfer him from the wheelchair to the bed. When his legs gave out completely, the lyrics ceased to be a metaphor. Pastor Cone was literally leaning his entire earthly weight onto his wife. And in those moments, as she bore the physical burden of the man she loved, Needle leaned her own spiritual weight entirely upon the Lord. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. She sang it in the middle of the night when the ventilator beeped or when his muscles cramped and she had to massage his hands in the dark. It became the soundtrack of Ecclesiastes 4 in motion. When he fell into frustration over his failing body, her song was the rope that pulled his spirit back up. Pastor Cone couldn't speak the words to join her, but he knew the rhythm of his wife's song better than his own sermons. He would sit in his chair, eyes closed, listening to the soft snip of her sewing scissors, the rustle of fabric, and the low, steady hum of safe and secure from all alarms. For Pastor Cone, that hum was the sound of utter safety. Wayne Needle Cone's most important song wasn't a performance, it was a pure melodic act of defiance against a cruel disease. It was the sound of a Proverbs 31 woman rolling up her sleeves, looking the darkness right in the eye, and mending her husband's broken world with nothing but a needle, a thread, and a promise never to let him fall without being there to lift him back up. Homer had a lyre made of tortoise shell and sheep gut to sing his epics. I have a tablet with a smudge of Jerry's thumbprint and a battery that dies if you leave it unplugged too long. But the job is the same. I am the singer of the tale, and the tale is an odyssey. They tell me the old bards used to sing of great warriors crossing the wine dark Aegean Sea, battling six-headed monsters and sirens. But I tell you, the truest epics are not fought with bronze swords on foreign shores. They are fought with pressure-treated pine and cream of mushroom casseroles right here in Trussville, aka Piney Grove. Listen to the song of my crew. I sing of Jerry Wallace, a man of rough hands and holy stubbornness, who became my legs when mine turned to stone. I sing of the mighty tradespeople of Piney Grove, who arrived not with chariots, but in Ford F-150s, wielding circular saws to build a wooden bridge from my front porch to the world. They did not conquer a city, but they conquered the stairs, and heaven recorded the victory. I sing of the women of the fellowship hall who saw a ship taking on water and decided to patch the hull with Tupperware. Their mercy came baked in 90 by 13 glass dishes, a relentless tide of grace that defied the creeping paralysis of my own throat. And what of the monster we faced? It was not a cyclops in a cave. It was three letters on a doctor's chart, ALS. The medical books call it a disease. In my song, it is simply a long shadow. It crept in slowly, binding my hands, stealing the baritone from my chest, and tethering me to this beige chair. It thought it was burying me in the dark. It thought it could swallow the captain, but the monster made a fatal theological miscalculation. A shadow, no matter how long, cannot exist on its own. It is only the proof of a blinding, brilliant light standing directly behind it. The monster took my voice, so I learned to speak in the silence. It took my pulpit, so I made this sunroom my sanctuary, looking out the glass at a universe I could no longer walk through, but could finally see clearly. My voyage is almost over. The sea is growing very quiet, and the harbor is coming into view. When you tell this story, do not sing of a tragic shipwreck. Sing of a captain who found his truest strength only after he dropped the oars. Sing of the crew who carried him to the water's edge. The ship is dissolving, yes, but the ground beneath my feet, the ground is finally solid again. End of song. Now, someone wipe this screen. The bard needs a nap. The lexicon of the seated. The Tuesday morning rain was coming down in sheets, turning the Piney Grove Church parking lot into a sprawling puddle of red Alabama clay. Inside the parsonage sunroom, Jerry Wallace stood by the glass, watching the downpour with a mug of black coffee in his hand. "Well, Pastor," Jerry sighed, shaking his head at the weather, "I was going to go over and talk to the deacons about the roof leak in the fellowship hall, but you know what they say. You can't really know a man until you walk a mile in his shoes. And right now their shoes are probably dry, and mine would be covered in mud." From the center of the room, Pastor Cone sat immobilized in his beige lift chair. His right eye gave a slow, deliberate twitch. His thumb found the screen of his tablet. Tap, click, dot. Jerry heard the familiar chime and turned around. "Jerry, I haven't worn out the soles of my shoes in 3 years. My wingtips look like they just came out of the box. We need to update the cultural lexicon." Jerry smiled, pulling up his wooden stool. "Update the lexicon? You mean you want to change the dictionary?" "I mean, the English language is terribly biased toward the bipedal," the synthesized voice stated flatly. "The whole of human anthropology revolves around walking, but as a man bound to a 300-pound battery-operated chariot, I find these idioms highly exclusionary. I am officially fabricating my own." Jerry chuckled, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "All right, Pastor, let's hear the translations. What do you do when a visiting preacher comes over and says, 'Let's take a walk and talk it over'?" Cone's thumb danced across the glass. "I look him dead in the eye and say, 'Let's go burn some tread,' or if it's a long conversation, 'Let's drain a battery.' It adds a certain level of industrial grit to pastoral counseling, don't you think?" "Oh, absolutely," Jerry laughed. "What about when the church gets in a tight spot and somebody tells you to stand your ground? I prefer lock your brakes. It is much more definitive. A man can be pushed off his ground, Jerry, but when you lock the brakes on a motorized wheelchair, it takes a forklift to move you." Jerry wiped a tear of laughter from his eye. Okay. How about when Needle tells you to put your best foot forward? I ask her which footrest she would like me to adjust, or I tell her I am putting my best voltage forward. The principle remains the same. The room fell quiet for a moment, save for the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. The banter faded, leaving the space open for the heavier theological truth that always lingered just beneath Cohn's humor. Cohn's thumb returned to the screen, his movements slower now, more thoughtful. They are just words, Jerry, but words shape how we see the world. People equate spiritual maturity with physical movement. We talk about our walk with God. We tell people to step out in faith. But what happens when the legs stop working? Does the faith stop? Jerry looked down at his coffee mug. No, sir, it just looks different. It looks stationary, Cohn typed. And the world hates stationary things. The world thinks if you aren't moving, you are dying. But in this chair, I have learned that the deepest spiritual work doesn't require a single footstep. Cohn paused, looking out the window at the heavy rain. You said earlier that you can't know a man until you walk a mile in his shoes. That might be true for the walking world, but if you want to know a man in this chair, you don't walk a mile in his shoes. He tapped the screen to trigger the final thought, his eyes locking onto his closest friend. If you want to know a man in this chair, you sit an hour in his silence. You sit still long enough to realize that you don't have to walk toward grace. If you lock your brakes and wait, grace will come directly to you. Jerry sat perfectly still, the profound weight of the translated idiom settling deep into his chest. He looked at his friend, stationary, confined, and yet casting a shadow larger than any man he had ever known. Lock your brakes, Jerry whispered. I like that, Pastor. I really do. The tablet let out one final sharp chime. Good. Now take your dry shoes into the kitchen and see if Needle has any of that pound cake left. My battery is running low. The theology of the Bible. The midday sun was pouring through the French doors of the parsonage, warming the hardwood floors. In the center of the sunroom, Pastor Cohn sat in his beige lift chair. The tray table was locked into place across his lap, holding a steaming bowl of Needle's chicken and dumplings. Needle stood beside him, holding a large handmade cloth. It was beautifully stitched because Needle never made anything without care, but its purpose was undeniably clinical. She leaned over and gently tied the two strings behind his neck, smoothing the fabric down over his chest. Cohn's right eye gave a sharp, frustrated twitch. He stared down at the cloth. His right thumb, trembling slightly with the effort, found the screen of his tablet. Tap, click, dot. The mechanical voice cut through the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Take it off, Needle, please. Needle didn't move to untie it. She just rested her hand on his shoulder. Thomas, you know we can't. Your swallowing is getting worse. If you choke or spill, it'll ruin your good shirt and it'll burn your skin. It's just to keep you clean. Jerry Wallace, who had just walked in carrying a stack of mail, stopped in the doorway. He read the heavy, suffocating tension in the room instantly. He leaned against the doorframe, knowing better than to interrupt, but staying close enough to catch the weight. Cohn's thumb moved aggressively across the glass, the tapping sharper and louder than usual. I am a pastor, Needle. For 40 years I wore the towel. I wore the apron. That is the garment of a shepherd. He paused, letting the synthetic voice echo, his chest heaving slightly with the emotional exertion. Jesus took off his outer garments, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed the feet of his disciples. The towel is the symbol of service. It means you have the strength to bend down and wash the dirt off someone else. The apron means you are the one serving the meal. Jerry wears the apron. You wear the apron, Needle. Cohn looked down at his chest, his eyes shining with a bitter, defeated grief. This is a bib. A bib is for infants. A bib is for the helpless. A bib says, I have nothing left to give, and I cannot even feed myself. I spent my entire life trying to be the man with the towel. I don't know how to be the man in the bib. Needle's eyes filled with tears, but her hands, the same hands that had held this family together for half a century, remained completely steady on his shoulder. It was Jerry who spoke first. He pushed off the door frame and walked over, pulling up his wooden stool right next to the lift chair. You're right about the towel, Pastor, Jerry said, his voice low and gravelly. It is a holy thing to wear it, but if I can speak plainly, there's a whole lot of pride hiding inside that towel, too. Cohn's eyes darted to Jerry, defensive and sharp. Think about it, Jerry continued, leaning forward. When you're the one wearing the towel, you're the one in control, you're the provider. You get the blessing of giving, and you get to keep your dignity intact while you do it. It's easy to be humble when you're the one holding the wash basin. Needle picked up the spoon, stirring the dumplings slowly to let them cool. Jerry is right, David, she whispered. Do you remember how Peter reacted when Jesus came to him with that towel? Cohn knew the scripture by heart. His thumb found the screen, slower this time. Peter said, You shall never wash my feet. Exactly, Needle said softly. Peter couldn't stand it. He wanted to be the strong one. He wanted to be the one serving. He thought letting the Lord wash him was a humiliation. But Jesus told him, Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Jerry reached out and tapped the edge of the cloth, covering Cohn's chest. When you wore the towel, Pastor, you were teaching Piney Grove how to give grace, Jerry said. But this right here, this bib, this is where you teach us how to receive it. It is a terrifying thing to be completely helpless, to let someone else wipe your chin, to let someone else carry your weight. But if you don't let Needle put this bib on you, you're robbing her of her chance to wear the towel. Cohn went entirely still. The theology of it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his whole life preaching about grace, unmerited, unearned favor for the completely helpless. But a man never truly understands grace until he is stripped of all his strength, confined to a chair, and forced to realize he cannot even feed himself. The bib wasn't a symbol of humiliation. It was the ultimate garment of surrender. It was the physical manifestation of yielding entirely to the love of another. Needle lifted the spoon, bringing it gently to his lips. "Let me serve you, Thomas," she whispered, her voice thick with absolute, unshakable devotion. "Let me wear the apron for a while. You've earned the rest." Cohn's eyes softened. The bitter resistance drained out of his posture, leaving only a profound, quiet peace. He opened his mouth, accepting the food and accepting the profound grace that came with it. When he finished the bite, his thumb moved to the tablet one last time. Tap, click, dot. "You may leave the bib on, Needle. The stitching is actually quite exceptional." He paused, his eyes sliding over to Jerry with that familiar, dry spark. "However, if Jerry ever attempts to spoon feed me and makes airplane noises while doing it, I am officially resigning from the ministry." Jerry let out a booming laugh that rattled the French doors, and Needle smiled, wiping a stray drop of broth from the edge of the handmade cloth. The giant of ALS was still in the room, but the bib was no longer a defeat. It was just the newest uniform in the sanctuary. The evening sun had dipped below the tree line, leaving the sunroom bathed in the soft amber glow of the corner lamp. Thomas sat quietly in his beige lift chair. The bitter sting of surrendering to the bib had passed weeks ago, replaced by the quiet, humbling grace of allowing his wife to wear the apron of service. Tonight, Needle wasn't holding the plain, handmade cloth she usually used. Instead, she unfolded a slightly worn, meticulously laundered piece of heavy cotton. It was a thoughtful gift that had arrived in the afternoon mail from their dear friend Carol. Carol knew this specific valley well. She had walked the long shadow of ALS with her own husband, step by grueling step, until he had crossed over. Now she was passing a piece of his armor on to the next soldier. Needle stepped up to the beige chair and gently draped the fabric over Thomas's chest. As she reached around the back of his neck to tie the strings, Thomas looked down at the embroidered letters stitched across the front. They didn't read Piney Grove Church or Man of God. Stitched in bold, unapologetic thread were the words, "Real men wear bibs." His thumb found the screen of his tablet. Tap, click, dot. Carol's husband was a good man. The tablet chimed softly in the quiet room. A strong man. Needle finished the knot and rested her hands on his shoulders, smoothing the fabric down against his chest. "He was," she agreed quietly, "and so are you, Thomas." There was a time when he would have fought the indignity of the garment, longing for the days when he was the one holding the towel, but looking at the embroidered words, a profound, unifying peace settled over him. It wasn't just a bib anymore. It was a mantle. It was the shared uniform of men who had fought the giant, men who had learned that true strength isn't found in what you can carry, but in the grace of letting your loved ones carry the weight for you. His right eye gave a slow, contented twitch. His thumb moved one last time. before dinner. Tell Jerry, the mechanical voice announced, carrying a faint hint of that old pastoral swagger, that the theological dress code in the sunroom has officially been updated. Needle smiled, her eyes shining in the lamplight as she picked up the spoon, and in the quiet sanctuary of the beige chair, the real man let himself be served.